Greetings, folks. My name is Dustin Cormier, and this is an episode of How to Rock Astrology. Today, I'm going to be hanging out with my friend Ernst Wilhelm. Ernst is a great astrologer that's been doing awesome work on YouTube as in the world of tropical Vedic astrology.
My pleasure. It's always fun to spend some time with you.
I appreciate it, my friend. So, today, I have brought you here today, Ernst, to talk a little bit about eclipses. Now, whenever you have some great eclipse videos that you put on your channel, my interest here was to kind of scratch out a little bit of the layman's understanding of what it is that you are transmitting when you talk about eclipses. Now, to give it short thrift, I'm going to kind of unbox this a little bit, but essentially, I've always been wondering what you mean when you talk about how these eclipses have like a 1500-year cycle, where the present eclipse that happens in today's time seems to resonate with another eclipse chart that you've given from some of them are from 1000 AD, and there's another one from 600 AD. So, just to unbox this a little bit, I've made a few little pictures to kind of show what I'm talking about. It almost seems like there's some concentric rings of phenomenon with these eclipses. There's the what you call the foundational eclipse chart, which can span around 1500 years. It seems to me that there's another possible 18.6 year chart cycle. It might be signaling either the manifestation through Rahu or termination, ketu, of some kind of karma. And then there's the present day cycle, a state of manifestation for both the foundational and 18.6 year cycle. Essentially, this is an example of what I'm kind of getting at. In your recent solar eclipse video, you were talking about the solar eclipse on the south node. And this just recently happened, I believe, on October 25th, 2022. You gave, I kind of sketched out the chart here of this recent eclipse that we've been experiencing. Now, there, about 18.6 years ago, there was a similar South Node eclipse in Scorpio. There was one actually in November 13th, 2004, and then another one the year before that in 2003. I'm not sure of how this middle one fits, but what I would like to first ask you about is the nature of what you call the foundational eclipse.
Okay. Yeah, a couple things I want to explain. First of
Please
all,
do.
um, so Rahu and Ketu take 18.6 years to travel around the zodiac.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, the eclipse cycles happen every 18 years, 9 through 11 days.
Nine
Okay.
through
Now, I
11 days.
always, half the time, I end up saying 18.6 years because I'm so stuck on the 18.6 year number
Okay.
from all the Rahu Ketu courses.
Hmm.
But it's actually eclipse cycles. The eclipse repeats itself every 18 years, 9 to 11 days. And that 9 to 11 day variation is depending on the amount of leap years we have at that time,
Oh,
within that 18-year cycle. So
got
you
it.
want to say about 18 years, 10 days.
Okay.
Now, what's interesting about that is that every eclipse will happen 10 days earlier. So like in 2004, you had an eclipse on like November something.
About the
And then
13th.
this year's eclipse was about 10 days earlier on
Right.
October 25th, right?
Right.
So the next cycle in 18 years will happen around October 15th.
Got it.
And that'll be the cycle of this. Now, one thing that's interesting about that, that means that the eclipses travel backwards one drachana at a time on the average.
Hmm.
And so one thing we can actually use to determine different effects of eclipses is we can, in a particular cycle, is we can see what drachana the eclipse is in,
Yeah, the D3
which
chart.
is the 1/3 division.
Right.
Okay, so that's just a little tip to throw out there for people to
Cool.
start using. Okay, so um, so that's how the eclipse cycles go. Now, like I said, now what makes them the cycle is your big question. What creates a cycle that
Hmm.
starts at this foundational eclipse? Okay, so the way eclipses work, an eclipse cycle starts at the North Pole or at the South Pole. So it starts at one of the poles. And when that eclipse happens, it's usually about 18 degrees from the Rahu or Ketu, because eclipses happen at Rahu and Ketu, right?
Right.
So the furthest an eclipse can happen from Rahu or Ketu is about 18 degrees.
Got it.
So when it happens at the North Pole, it's happening and what I mean by North Pole, it's visible at the North Pole.
Okay. Okay.
Which means we're not going to see it down here in America.
Gotcha.
Okay? But
Yeah.
the North Pole, they're seeing their frame of reference of the sky is totally different. So they'll see an eclipse up there. We won't see it here.
Okay.
And it's a partial eclipse, which means it's barely an eclipse. I mean, the sun is just brushing the moon, or the moon is just brushing the sun. I mean, in fact, it could be so partial you might not even notice it.
Right.
Okay. So it's an extreme partial eclipse. It's just barely enough to be called an eclipse. And that happens at the North or South Pole. Then 18 years, about 10 days later, there's another eclipse that's a little closer to the equator and about 30 to 60 minutes closer to Rahu or Ketu.
30 to 60 minutes.
So instead of the first one's about 18 degrees, the next one's going to be 17 to 17.5 degrees away.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
And the eclipse is a little closer to the equator, which means it starts becoming visible at lower latitudes. Okay.
So that means that in America and closer to the equator,
eventually it'll become visible. It won't be visible that year, but it's moving towards the equator, towards more and more visible by more and more of the land mass, which, you know, by more and more people. Okay.
Right.
Now, whether it's visible or not, it has an impact. But eclipses that happen that are visible to a country have a bigger impact on the global events for that country, or the world events for that country. So if they see an eclipse in China and we don't see it here, say North China, we don't see it here, it's going to impact North China more than here or Mexico or whatever. Okay.
That makes sense.
But really, the eclipse really does impact the entire world.
Right.
Okay. But if you see the eclipse, if the country sees the eclipse, if it's visible from there, it does have a bigger impact.
Okay.
And also on those people. Okay. So every 18 years, 10 days, the eclipse happens a little closer to Rahu and Ketu, 30 to 60 minutes closer, until finally it happens right and really close to conjunction within 30 minutes of Rahu or Ketu. When that happens, you have the most full eclipse.
And that's that total eclipse that we often see.
That's the absolute, not only the total, the longest total eclipse. Got it? Because you can have total eclipses within a span of degrees.
Okay.
Of where the sun or moon is a certain amount of degrees from Rahu or Ketu, where it's total. But as it gets closer, it gets, you know, more total.
Okay.
And so finally, the equator that happens over the eclipse, the eclipse that is visible from the equator is the midpoint. That's when the eclipse is most powerful, it's most full.
Interesting.
And it takes about 650 years for an eclipse cycle to go from the North Pole to the equator.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is where this is coming from.
That's where this is coming from. Okay. Then while this is happening from the North Pole, an eclipse going down, it gets to the equator, at which point the eclipse is closest to Rahu or Ketu. At that point, the next eclipse, another 18 years, 10 days, is 30 minutes to 1 degree further from Rahu and Ketu.
So now it's going down the equator.
Now it's going south.
Now it's going south.
One eclipse at a time.
Right.
And by the time it gets to the furthest, the last eclipse is where it's barely eclipsed again. And again, the sun or moon is going to be about 18 degrees from Rahu or Ketu at that point, from the nodal axis, let's say. That's the end of the cycle. So the eclipse, just like the moon, has a waxing and waning phase. Right. From the first eclipse being very, very waxing, or very, very waning, you know, very dark.
Gotcha.
Well, very light, let's say, right? Because an eclipse that's partial is very bright, and eclipse that's full is very dark, right?
And it's dark. Gotcha.
You can't see it. So the eclipse gets larger and larger and larger and larger until it's a full-on eclipse. And then it gets more and more diminished until it's a partial eclipse. takes about 650 years to go from North Pole to equator,
Mm-hmm.
and another 600 years to go from 650 years to go from equator to South Pole. So
Is
we're
there a
looking at an eclipse
difference?
cycle about 1300 years.
Right, right. And is there a
Okay.
difference between the North Pole and the South Pole?
No, and no, there's these eclipses that start north and travel south. And then there's also at the same time, there's an eclipse that starts south and moves north.
Now, this I think was the next thing that I was going to kind of
Yeah.
start to ask you. I'll
And
let you finish. Yeah.
there's about 19 to 21 eclipse cycles happening from the north to the south and then from the south to the north. So there's like 42 eclipse cycles happening,
At the
moving down
same.
from the south to the north at any given time.
Okay.
So
Wow.
we're
That
constantly getting bombarded by lots of
concentric.
cycles, lots of
Right.
eclipses, a lot of cycles. Every year we get a little more than two eclipses because an eclipse
Mm,
happens a little less than 6 months. So we'll have two eclipses a year, and then every once in a while we'll have three eclipses in one calendar year. Okay.
mhm,
So in an 18-year period, we get a few more eclipses than 18
mm.
in one direction because half of them are coming from north to south, the other half are going from south to north. So we have about 21 eclipses happening in each direction. So that's about 42 eclipses happening, cycles active at any time. I mean,
Wow.
that's huge when you think about it, to understand that, wow, we're undergoing 42 cycles,
Yeah.
in our lives at all times. And these cycles are coming and hit every 18 years, we repeat the cycle.
Right. So after about the 18 years,
Mhm.
uh, you know, is the, I showed you this little example here of this picture where
Mhm.
we've got the present day solar south node eclipse. Then we've got the 18 and 10 or so days uh behind, like previous to that. And
Yeah.
then we've got another foundational eclipse.
Yeah. And the foundational eclipse is that first eclipse in the cycle. So the one,
Mm-hmm.
if for a cycle that's starting at the North Pole and traveling south,
Got it.
it's that first very partial eclipse
Got it.
right there.
Okay,
Okay.
so that's the and is that going to either start on the north or south pole kind of arbitrarily?
Well, there's always one starting every year or at the beginning of every cycle, there's always one they start at both.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on if we're dealing with Rahu and Ketu and where the sun and moon are and all that stuff. So
Mm-hmm.
when they start, there's an equal amount that start at the north and an equal amount that start on the
Gotcha.
south pole.
Okay. Now,
Okay.
Ernst, this does lead me to another question or another figure that I would have liked to show here. Now, you're blowing my mind, and I love that you always do. I wanted to show this. This is a simple picture because I thought maybe I saw your last three eclipse videos, and it was basically we had the recent solar eclipse of the South Node. You've also shown the recent lunar eclipse of the South
Mhm.
Node, and you showed that the foundational date for the lunar eclipse stretched back to about 1680. Of the recent lunar eclipse of the sun being in Scorpio
Mhm.
and the moon being in Taurus. Now, when I looked at one of your previous eclipse videos, I believe it was a solar eclipse on the north node that would have happened when the sun was in Taurus of this year. And you showed that there was a foundational eclipse that stretched back to about 1390.
Mhm.
Now, this was me I was playing with the possibility that you would have four, because it would almost make sense. One for the solar eclipse on Rahu, one for the
Yeah.
lunar eclipse on Rahu, one for the solar eclipse on Ketu, and then one for the lunar eclipse on Ketu. Now, that's about generally the four that kind of get usually contained within a year. Um,
Exactly. That's what we have. Yep.
and it's
The
bet
two
so
eclipse cycles. Yep.
right, right. So would it be better to say that within the 18.10 the 18 years and 10 days that typically happen, are all of the eclipses that happen through that all like an entangled quantum quilt of separate
Exactly.
narratives?
That's how you can look at it. During that 18 years, you've got about 42 different eclipses
Got it.
happening.
Got it.
So within the 18-year period, we're getting impacted about 42 times if it hits us in a significant way.
Hmm.
I mean, it lands on a planet or point or house cusp.
Mm.
Planets I find to be the most powerful. And the closer to the planet, the more powerful. Different people notice eclipse differently.
Right.
If the eclipse is more than 10, 15 degrees away, I don't doesn't really impact me.
Hmm.
But I know people, I've seen people with an eclipse, 20 degrees from a planet. It's like, boom, they feel it. So you want to pay attention initially until you get a feel for, how easily moved a person is by eclipses.
Definitely.
How, if it's in the sign of whatever sign it's in, whatever house cusp it's in, whatever it's sharing a sign with, whatever planets it's sharing a sign with, to pay attention to it
For sure.
and
Certainly.
and watch what happens. Yeah. And what's
So,
nice about this with this foundational eclipse is it really does talk about this journey of this eclipse. So
and there's a story.
there's a story to this eclipse. This eclipse is here to do certain things. Like this one eclipse we had on October 25th is a lot about countries negotiating and coming up with, making deals between each other, I mentioned. And one of the big things that's happened in October is that, Iran and Russia, Iran saying, yeah, we're going to give you guys missiles. They're making
Hmm.
deals. And there's a
Hmm.
lot of these deals happening that we're never going to know about between
Hmm.
all countries in the world or negotiating with each other and deciding who they need to be friends with.
No kidding. Yeah, yeah.
But that's one aspect of evidence to that.
Right.
So that's what this eclipse is cycle's about. It's about making deals. It's about Venus. It's about you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, and we'll be better off for it.
Right. Right.
Um, and depending where that planet's landing, it's going to determine things. Like it's on my Jupiter. Eclipse was right on my Jupiter, and I got a whole new deal with my kids.
Right. Right.
It's like
Okay.
we're creating whole new thing going on right now. That's
Well,
going to be really great.
I would
So
like to ask you, Ernst, when you say that the eclipse, because as you've mentioned, oftentimes the node is far away from where the actual sun and moon hit.
mhm.
When you say that the proximity to a certain planet is going to be affected, are you talking about the position of the node at that time or the position of the sun and the moon?
The position of the sun and moon.
Right. So
Yeah.
wherever that is actually happening, the
Yeah.
node just happens to be where it's going to be, but it's the
Yeah.
sun and the moon that you're looking at.
Exactly. And the closer the sun or the moon is to the node, the more powerful of an eclipse it is because the more
Right.
complete it is, right?
Right.
And
Okay.
so right now we're having powerful eclipses because they're right by the sun and moon. I mean, they're
Right.
close. They're not far, far, far away, if I remember right.
Hmm.
I remember the one that I used, predict that we would have an outbreak, before the COVID.
Mm.
That eclipse that stirred up the COVID. I mean, everything was right there, right on ketu. Pluto was there. Pluto's south node was also there.
Wow.
So
Right.
we basically kind of had a Pluto eclipse at the same time.
I kind of mentioned that, and that's something I've been
Yeah.
interested in is Plutonian eclipses, especially when it's
Yeah,
in
that's something I
Capricorn.
want to put in the Kala actually, is just the nodes of all the planets. So we can start
Cool.
calculating eclipses of all the planets. And I think they can really stack up like they did for the whole COVID event with the standard eclipse. But
That's big
so
stuff in
these
evolutionary astrology.
eclipses, yeah, are just really huge for the long game.
Mm.
There's this long game of creation.
The
And
eclipses, you said. I'm sorry.
yeah, the eclipse cycles, because
Okay.
this is a long plan. This is like God setting us up for 1300 years of something.
Some narrative,
Yeah, and he's got, you know, 21, 21 north and 21, 42 little strings
puppet
attached to
strings.
this little puppet called Earth.
Right. Cool.
And these eclipses are like 42 themes that are coming through life over a period of multiple years. Each theme is 1300 years, but they don't all start on the same year and end at the same
Hmm.
year. They're overlap. So
And they
one
all
theme ends,
different
another one
times.
comes in. And I think, we need to spend a lot more time studying these eclipse cycles and really start piece them together in the context of all the things and what they're doing. And through that weaving that you mentioned, really
Mm.
see the story. Because
Right.
this this is the most significant part of the narrative.
Mm,
It's the biggest part of the script are these eclipse cycles. Most people try to figure out the story as of what's happening to life on Earth with the slow moving planets,
hmm
with Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, or with Saturn and Jupiter, if you don't use Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto.
hmm
But really, the biggest part of the story is happening based on these eclipse cycles.
Wow, no
And it's a
kidding.
big chunk of brain work to take these, 42 eclipse cycles
Hmm
that are happening at any time and try to write those up into a narrative
Yeah, and
of
quantify
what's
them.
actually going to happen. I mean, it's like a lot of stuff to juggle, but it's this way. You just look at one eclipse at a time and you can nail some events.
Mm. I
Really
mean,
simple.
I was just going to say, most people think that humanity is just this kind of simple thing, but astrology shows us that there's so
Yeah,
much to going on to really
there's a
predict
lot
what's going to
going on.
happen. And it's irrelevant to prediction in global and collective events. And we all fit, our personal narrative fits into this global
Totally.
enmeshing.
Yeah.
So this is from this, there's two questions I'd like to bounce at you. They're both in the same line. Number one is, can we look at, could we and should we look at the time of the foundational eclipse, see what happened in history, and then configure reverberations of important elements of the present narrative of the eclipse
Um,
that's happening today?
well, we could try to do that, but usually the beginning eclipse does not have that big of an impact because it's a very partial eclipse,
All right. Okay.
right? So what we want to do though, we want to look at when was the previous eclipse cycle?
Which to the 18 point
18 years, 10 days.
18
So
years,
see, if
10
I'm going to
days.
get hit, if I'm going to get smashed with an eclipse,
Hmm
the first thing I do, I use the word smash because I mean sometimes I mean that's kind of a bad word, but I'm using the context of smash, like when I got ran over by a truck on my
Right.
tandem,
Yep. Yep.
or smash home run. It could be a home run
You're
eclipse too. I mean,
totally. Depending
but
on,
if it's going to be close on a planet, it's going to be some kind of smash. It could be
right.
either way. Okay.
Yeah.
Now,
Transformation is apparent
yeah,
in
it's
what's
just you're
happening.
something's going to happen in your life that's important to you, that
Right.
matters.
Right.
And that's what it comes down to. It's going to make a difference in your life somehow, the things that happen on an eclipse. Okay. So I'll always look at the previous one and say, oh, what happened to me during that eclipse? What
Hmm
changed in me on that eclipse? Like the eclipse we had in early this year in April. Okay, that one was hit tagging me. So I looked at the previous one, and the previous one didn't really hit any of my planets. So I skipped it. So then I went to the previous one, which was 36 years ago, right?
Okay.
And on that day is the day my mom showed up and said, I'm divorcing your dad,
Right.
you know?
Wow.
And that day, I made a decision in my mind how I was going to live my life because obviously my parents couldn't take care of me. It was my conception of that.
Right. Right.
It's like,
So
oh,
that,
you guys can't even stay together. I guess I'll have to take care of myself.
right.
After that, I started being an overly responsible person, right? Like
Mm,
within the minute of my mom saying that, that eclipse coming down on me, I made the internal decision to be an overly responsible person.
right.
Okay.
Right.
36 years later, I get another eclipse and I'm like going, screw this stuff. I'm done being responsible.
No
I'm
kidding.
like,
Cool.
and I'm like, it totally shifted my consciousness and it actually made me, brought back that memory of, oh yeah, I remember that. It was like a wall went down and I just said, this is how it's going to be. And I'm kind of sick right now. I got really sick on that eclipse this
Hmm
April because I was just taking on more responsibilities than really I needed to. And it was
Wow.
like that eclipse 36 years later was like, hey, dude. And that eclipse was an eclipse that was about one's um, relationship with authority and who's the
hmm
authority, what does the authority provide?
hmm
So my parents were the authority, they were providing security. I decided they couldn't provide security. So I was going to
Hmm.
provide my own security and become the authority, you
So
know?
that is amazing, and I would like to
Yeah.
ask, it seems to me that you've got that precedent set for this, was it the March one you said, or April, I think it
Yeah.
was, of
So
this year?
it's all part of the same thing. It's all about authority, who's in charge, and authority is the responsible person. Authority
Hmm
doesn't mean I'm I'm the master and you're the slave. Authority means I'm the responsible person here ultimately. No,
Right, right.
um,
Are you
I have
getting
the
that
authority
from the
because I'm responsible for everything that happens here. Like at a
Mhm.
company, the manager is responsible because he has authority there because everything that happens there lands on his shoulders, right?
Right, for
And he
sure.
gets punished for it or gets a raise for
Yes, and it can go good or bad for
it.
sure.
Yeah.
Are you getting that theme, relating it to authority? Probably not because it was in Taurus, but because that was what was in the foundational.
That was it was in the foundation eclipse. Exactly.
Got it. Okay,
Okay.
got it.
So that foundation eclipse is like a whisper of this
The
is what we're
themes.
moving towards.
Gotcha.
And then the biggest impact of that, the culmination of that, is at that most full eclipse at the equator, 650 years later.
Right.
And
Right.
that's so it's building up to that, getting bigger and
Okay.
bigger and bigger until it hits home on that one.
Right.
But that most partial eclipse, that's an extremely important eclipse.
Yes. Yeah.
That's like, the full moon eclipse, let's call it. It's where
Mhm.
the eclipse is full
Right.
versus the new eclipse where the eclipse is partial, like when the
Okay.
moon is partial.
Cool. Very
Now,
cool.
just as in India, how they take the new moon and they calculate lunar months, some parts of India take the full moon and calculate lunar months from full moon to full moon, right?
Oh, cool.
They're both important points. So
Right.
with the eclipse, we really need to start finding that culmination eclipse, which is something I've been a little lazy about because you can't just look it up.
Hmm.
You have to kind of dig a little bit and calculate it.
And feel
But
out.
it's not that hard to do. Once you see it start coming close, once you see that, oh, Rahu and Ketu are really close, within 2 degrees, then I'll say, okay, when this might impact me in my lifetime.
Hmm.
So then or in this person's lifetime.
Right.
And so then
Right.
I'll say, well, when was the culmination eclipse? Was it 2 cycles ago? Was it 2 cycles from now? And I can just calculate out the next eclipse, see how close it is to the node, and find the one that's closest to the node. And then I know that's a culmination. And then we want to look at that chart too, ideally.
When you are doing your own personal eclipse research of for yourself and for the study that you often give on your channel, do you just simply look on, you just usually do an annual one. You'll say, this one is a kind of, they're far away, they're not that big a deal. And then sometimes you'll say, this one's going to be an important one. And it's because the sun and moon are close to the node at that time. Would you generally recommend do you look for eclipses that have this proximity, which means the chapter is coming to that intense narrowing and closing?
Yeah, I mean, those are going to be bigger ones, but really, I look for any eclipses where there's a lot going on.
Planetary wise.
So if there's an eclipse and you got a planet conjunct the eclipse point, like
Mm,
in the same sign as the eclipse, and especially the closer it is,
hmm.
that's a more powerful eclipse.
Right, right,
Because,
right.
like, say, like Venus was part of this last eclipse.
Hmm. Hmm.
It was right in there. In the foundational eclipse, Venus was part of the eclipse.
Uh-huh.
So I know, wow, this is going to be a major Venus eclipse.
Okay. And
It's going
that's
to be more important.
that
Now, and
correlation.
after that, I look for a proximity
Okay.
because you can kind of say the more planets that are strongly involved with the eclipse, then the more things are being impacted in a significant way.
Hmm.
So first, I want to see what's getting impacted, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Then
Yeah.
I want to see if there's any repeat themes between the foundation eclipse and the current eclipse.
Cool. This is
If I
so
see repeated
clarifying.
themes, oh yeah, it's going to be way bigger. This is one of the more important ones. And then I want to see how much force is there.
Hmm.
Okay, like how hard is the smash to the home run or the smash into the ground going to be? I look for proximity of planets to the eclipse on proximity of the sun or moon to the Rahu Ketu axis, to the
Self.
nodal axis.
And they're both really important.
Yeah, because that gives it the power, but the widespreadness of what it's impacting, and if there's repeating themes, I just look for what's going on with the planets.
Yeah,
That's the place to start because
yeah,
that's how you analyze it.
because
And
really, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
what's sad about eclipses, there's this, eclipses have this reputation of being bad things, you
That's
know?
why you're saying smashing is not the right word. It
It
kind of is in terms of
it can
impact.
go either way. If the eclipse cycle starts with a theme of love, for
Mm,
instance,
mhm.
then this eclipse is here to help people love better, you
Yeah,
know?
I totally see that.
And sometimes during that cycle, there'll be an eclipse where you've got Venus with the eclipse again, but now Saturn is there and Pluto is there. Well, that's going to be an intense experience to learn to love better
Mm.
with possible loss.
Right.
But it's still carrying that theme.
For
Whereas if you
sure.
get a theme, an eclipse that has a war and fighting theme starting,
Mm,
then yeah, this eclipse is going to be more troublesome or an accident related theme, whatever the
mm,
theme is. Um, but really, eclipses, when you think about it, you've got two eclipse cycles a year on average.
mhm.
And usually you have a solar and lunar one. So you've got like four eclipses
Right.
every year.
Mhm.
It's like I really have learned to start looking at a chart by looking at what eclipses are hitting the person.
Yeah, totally.
It's
I
like the
totally
first
get
thing I
that.
do because when eclipses hit the people, it usually it's usually what's revealing or creating whatever it's what's manifesting, it's indicating
Mm,
really the thing that's probably going to be most important in the person's life
at that time.
during
Mm,
that year. I remember one year I had one client, and this is why it really made me think, oh, don't ever make this mistake again. I had a client who, you know, had a rough year. I had
mhm,
a rough several years. And then I looked at all of her other timing methods. Everything looked pretty good.
mm,
I was like, don't worry, this year's going to be good. You got this, and you got this, and you got this. I didn't look at the eclipse, man. It
mhm.
was an eclipse for loss of loved ones. It comes and smashes her fourth house or mother or something, and her mom all of a sudden dies.
Right. Right.
And her mom's the only person who's only consistent, stable person in the girl's life.
Gotcha.
So her
Yeah.
mom dying is like 100 rugs pulled out from under her feet.
Mm,
And she
mhm.
was just left flattened.
Right.
And I was like, there was nothing that was going to make that year good at that point, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I often think about the difference between no matter what's going on astrologically,
Mhm.
there's still a material reality that has its own reality. And I find that eclipses tap into the
Oh yeah,
material sphere more
they,
than
they they really do. They change our lives in real ways,
mm,
you know,
mhm,
and the things that they're triggering generally, I think, become the most important things that year,
mm.
you
Now, I
know?
would like to ask you, Ernst, when you are researching these eclipses in this way, like for example, I mean, I'm sure we can all just be happy knowing that you are going to just keep spinning this wheel for us on your channel. But I would ask out of curiosity, for the sake of, for example, myself as an astrologer, if I'm trying to see the themes of an eclipse that's coming and try and correlate it to the foundational eclipse. How do you chase the foundational eclipse? Do you like
Okay.
go back?
Well, a couple things. First of all, there's this book. It's called The Eagle and the Lark
Hmm.
by Bernadette Brady. Okay. She's a Western astrologer. This book was published, good to see when it was published, I think in the 80s. Actually,
Cool.
19, um, where is the copyright on this thing?
Hmm. No rush.
1992. Okay.
1992.
And this is a book on Western astrology. It mostly talks about transits and secondary possessions, which are what bread and butter of Western astrologers.
Yep.
But then it has this whole section on eclipses and the cycles of eclipses, which are called the Saros cycle.
Okay.
Okay. And what's great about this book, she has an appendix where she gives the eclipses.
Wow.
Okay.
Hmm.
And she gives the eclipses with the number like 15 south. That means it's a south, the eclipse is the 15th eclipse that started south. That's in existence.
Wow.
And eventually this eclipse will end and a new 15 south will start. So when one 15 south star ends, a new one starts. Isn't that cool?
That's amazing. That's
Yeah.
truly amazing.
And best of all, in another appendix, she has the effects of all those eclipses. Like if we look
Whoa.
at this last one, let's see. Okay, this last one on this was the October 25th one,
Mm-hmm.
if I remember right.
Mm-hmm.
She says there's a Pluto Mars. This is a foundational eclipse. She goes, there's a Pluto Mars opposition, and the eclipse is conjunct Venus, with this conjunction sitting on the Uranus node midpoint. She uses midpoints.
Okay.
This eclipse series is about being forceful and taking power. It has a manic flavor about it, with great force or strength manifested in the relationship area. Individuals experiencing this series may experience sudden events like falling in or out of love or sudden sexual encounters. Individual may also exert a huge effort in some group activity. So she
Wow.
gives a little short paragraph explanation.
Just this
Now, what
prompt,
I
yeah.
do is I like to go find the foundational eclipse and calculate it myself.
Okay.
The reason I do that is because there's a few cases, first of all, where it's not common, where she might have not have known the correct foundational eclipse because of the data available.
Okay.
Imperfect. Okay. And she'll say that. She'll say the beginning of this we might not know the exact beginning of the cycle.
Okay.
Okay. So what I do, you go to the NASA website,
Mm-hmm.
and on the NASA website, you can find all the eclipse cycles, and they'll tell you, they number them. Like they number the eclipses, and when the cycle ends, they throw that number away and start a new number. Okay.
Do they use this numbering, like how she, as an
No, they don't
astrologer?
use the north south, the 7 north
Yeah.
and 6 south. They don't
Okay.
use that numbering. They'll just say eclipse one cycle 124.
Gotcha. Okay. Gotcha.
And so it's really the way NASA presents it, it's like kind of like, really, can't you just say 6 south? You
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, it's like, and when an eclipse cycle ends, they throw out, when 124 ends, they're going to throw it away. And when the next cycle starts, they'll just take the next number in the order and use it or something. So
Hmm.
this is the cycles in order that they've ran. But what's nice, they'll give a very accurate date for the foundational eclipse. They give very accurate dates and times for each eclipse. So you can just type that time and date into your thing. Now, the eclipses are for, GMT,
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Greenwich Mean Time.
Right.
So 0 time zone. And also the old eclipses, I believe they give in the Julian date. We now use Gregorian dates. And so there's
Okay.
a difference of a few days. So some astrology softwares try to correct for those calendar dates. Kala, we don't do it. The reason we don't, because when they introduced the Gregorian calendar in the 1500s, some countries followed it right away. Some countries took 300 years to follow it. So if we try to correct it, and nobody knows which country really did it, there's not really good records of it.
Mm-hmm.
So by forcing the dates to get adapted at a certain year, when the Catholic Church said, let's use this,
Right.
it screw up dates in a lot of countries.
Wow.
So you have to you go online, figure out how to adjust the Gregorian dates, and then use that. The good
Okay.
news is about half the cycles are new enough that we don't have to adjust the Gregorian calendar for.
Okay.
So
Okay.
be aware, if you punch in a date of a first eclipse in the series,
Mm-hmm.
if it's not an eclipse chart, well, you need to adjust it within 10 days or so to get the eclipse chart.
Right. So when you looked at that Eagle and the Lark book, you would see a certain given date for the foundation, and then she would have a thing
Let
that
me
says,
remember if she gives the foundation. Yeah, she does give the foundation. I don't remember right now if she adjusts it for Gregorian dates or Julian
gotcha,
dates.
gotcha. Okay.
But
And
you'll
that's,
figure out real quick because you'll calculate it, and
and it
it
won't
won't
be an
be an
eclipse.
eclipse. The sun and moon won't be anywhere real. They'll be really far from Rahu and Ketu.
Right. So if
They'll be
I
like
was,
60 degrees or so away.
okay. So if I'm using, I could use anything. I could use Kala. I could use whatever. I
Yeah.
would input the figure for what the general foundational eclipse that the author gives, and then I would look at it, and if it was slightly off, I would just go a few days ahead or a few days behind until I get the eclipse
Yeah.
that's given.
And the time, as long as you've calculated for Greenwich Mean Time, will be correct. Should be
Cool.
correct. Okay.
Okay, too.
Just
And
the
so that,
days. It's just a matter of equal days.
right.
Now,
And
the reason I like to calculate those is because, Bernadette, she relies heavily on Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto.
mhm,
She relies really heavily on midpoints.
mhm,
I rely heavily on a lot of other astrology techniques.
yeah,
So I want to see the chart and arrive at my own conclusion.
for sure.
However, before I started calculating my own charts, I was like really shocked how good her
Yeah,
results were. I
cool.
mean, for the most part, they're very, very good. If
Mm,
I just want to miss something and I want to double check her results, but it's like sometimes some of her results aren't that clear, and especially when I want to dig deeper.
mm,
But I'll tell you, so many of her results have, I mean, 80% of the time they feel like spot on.
right.
So you don't even do that work, and you're going to do really good. And then 20% of the time, it's like you're just not really sure,
Yeah.
maybe.
Mhm.
But 80%, like really spot on. It's a really fantastic book. I really recommend it.
Awesome.
And
Okay.
it's
Well,
easy.
that's,
It's like it's easy. It's not hard, especially with the tables in this book. It's like it's really can be put in the Astrology for Dummies book,
yeah,
but it
cool.
does really amazing stuff that you
Well,
don't want to miss in your readings.
and that's a wonderful prompt for, astrologers like us who are tropical Vedic astrologers to try and add our own ideas of what we can convey from the figures that she gives from her little prompt,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. Yeah.
Very good, Ernst. So I think if I had another question that I would like to ask, um, we've noticed that the eclipses, like for example, we had this recent eclipse. It was on October 25th. The one before this was off in the sense that it would have been in like November 13th. That's like 10 days off, like you said. So the eclipses are going back, and the themes are shared with the foundational eclipse. And the
Mhm.
theme of the last eclipse in this cycle, the one 18 years and 10 days ago, would be resonant with the themes, but it is moving. The previous eclipse is moving, and it's going to have different planets involved
Not only different planets, but different signs.
in different signs too.
Yeah,
Right.
so it's about 10 degrees backwards.
Right. And
So
there could be
usually
a
you'll get one eclipse in each dracona of a sign. So three eclipses in a sign, and
Mhm.
now it moves on to the next sign.
Right. Yes, that makes sense. So, with that being said, if we are trying to correlate a narrative for our personal growth and evolution as per what's happening in this eclipse, and we look at the previous eclipse, and we're looking for, I mean, I guess like you mentioned when you looked at the this eclipse of October 25th, you looked at the previous 18 years and 11 days, and you noticed that there wasn't much going on at that time.
Yeah,
Then you looked at the one previous to that, and it must have hit some important figures in your chart that caused
exactly.
the what happened with your
Yeah, it was
parents
like
splitting.
within a degree of Venus.
Right. Okay.
So it's
Okay.
like kaboom, major eclipse
And
there.
and you must mean your natal
Yeah,
Venus?
my natal Venus. Yeah.
Okay.
And that was
So,
the April eclipse, just to clarify. And so,
okay.
but the
Oh,
year
I'm
before
sorry. Thank you.
the,
Sorry
the
about
the
that.
eclipse that was in 2004, around April 2004,
Mhm.
didn't trigger anything significantly, and I couldn't go, huh, I had a life-changing event,
Right.
that
Right.
during that time. But then so I just went back to the next cycle because it's always going to carry a theme of
The
the
theme
previous cycle. Like
as
one time I
related.
had an accident. Okay.
Mhm.
I had a really bad accident, like fell 150 feet off a cliff. So you can
Mhm.
imagine the bruising and other damage.
Right.
And I instead of going to the hospital, I just went to the health food store and got some arnica homeopath.
Cool.
And I took that and I just healed amazing, and except for one thing that I eventually had to go get worked on because it was shattered,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah.
But all
Great.
the other breaks and bruises, I was shocked how amazingly they heal.
Mhm.
Okay. And and that and I was not a big user of homeopathy during that time. I
Mhm.
mean, it's not like I used for stuff. I was just a tough guy that just dealt with most stuff. But
Yeah.
I figured 150 or 120 foot off cliff, hitting lots of things coming down. I should probably get some arnica, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Cool.
So I got the arnica, and I was amazed at how fast I healed. During the same eclipse 18 years later, I end up throwing myself into the study of homeopathy.
Cool.
So I was like, wow, I had this theme of homeopathy, both eclipses,
Yeah, and both connected to that
that both
same.
there's this connection there. I had this amazing, and I never used homeopathy in that intermediary 18 years.
Gotcha.
Not a single time. I never bought it for my kids. I just
Hmm.
never used it. And then I threw myself into it to where I've got a whole homeopathic pharmacy, a whole homeopathic library. I spent a tremendous amount of time studying it, and I use it a lot now.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really fun actually to go look at your eclipse cycles. And with this book, you know, you can just kind of go here and say you got hit by 18 north.
Right.
You can just scroll backwards until you see 18 north again and see what degree it's on. It's all tropical degrees in this book.
Cool.
And then see if that eclipse hit you and follow the thread.
And then follow that narrative thread
Mm-hmm.
because that makes sense to me, Ernst. I guess how I see it is that ultimately the themes of this, the one that we're talking about, it is following the themes of the foundational eclipse. But like you said, even though every eclipse in that thread is going to be related to the foundational theme, not every eclipse is going to have shared planets of phenomena in that, which means it might not be that pertinent to you,
Exactly.
especially if it doesn't fall on any natal planets. But
Yeah.
if we
If it
see
doesn't,
something happening to us that's an eclipse, and we know that this eclipse is happening and it's touching important natal points, that's when we look at the foundational eclipse and we look at previous eclipses that we've experienced so that we can correlate anything that might have happened and see
yeah.
how this theme relates to what's
Yeah.
happening in the present chart.
And here's the thing about eclipses, though. Eclipses are kind of where the programming gets rewritten.
Mm.
So like when my parents got divorced on that April 6th, I think, eclipse in 1986, I wrote a program of how I was going to be responsible.
Yeah, right.
And I was stuck with that friggin' program. I could not rewrite it until the
Mm.
next eclipse. So
Yeah,
see, the program you write for yourself. I mean, eclipse is where, I mean, think what's kind of happening is there's this chalkboard and you say, this is how I do this. This is what's important to me. This is what I love. This is what I want. I never want to have in my life. We write that on this chalkboard on an
right,
eclipse. And when another eclipse comes around, we get to erase it and write something else.
right.
And
Cool.
we're living off that programming, whatever,
For the
for next 18
for
years,
the
right?
next 18 years.
And 10 days.
Right.
So if there are not every eclipse radically shifts your program.
Mm-hmm.
Some eclipses sink a seed, and you go, I remember that. And every once in a while, you go, I like that time, and you haven't really
Mm-hmm.
embraced it fully.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't a strong enough eclipse to grow the seed, but it sunk a seed.
Yeah.
And then an eclipse cycle or two eclipse cycles later, all of a sudden you're fully living that seed. Because it was just the beginnings of the program was written, but not enough to put you on autopilot with that program. But we are rewriting our programming during eclipses.
Mm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's, one of the reasons they say in India and stuff during an eclipse, just go on retreat. It's like, okay, go work on yourself, focus spiritually, rewrite your programming to be spiritual, right?
Because there's some program that's coming through, then now is the one chance that you have to
To really
repaint the
rewrite it.
picture.
Yeah. And of course, it's the program is relevant to the theme of the eclipse, though.
Mm.
So if it's
Mm.
not a spiritual eclipse, you can't really reprogram yourself, rewrite your spiritual programming. If it's a love eclipse or a relationship eclipse or a fighting eclipse or a fixed problems eclipse, whatever the theme is, you get to, you're going to adapt how you're rewriting, how you're going to rewrite how you deal with those type of themes.
Right.
Now, the thing is, it's not always a total rewrite.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
The one I
Depending
had in
on.
2004, absolute total rewrite. Like erase
Gotcha.
all the old data.
Yeah.
Usually, you add a word, you move a comma around.
Right.
Usually rewrite is just a little bit of editing.
Mm-hmm. Hmm.
But that editing can make a huge difference in our lives,
Hmm. Hmm.
you know? And later on, we might do a total rewrite based on the experience of what our edited programming was. It depends
Yeah,
on
it
the
depends
impact of the eclipse.
on how it falls out,
Yeah.
because I suppose we have the power to transform ourselves using different things, yoga or whatever ways that we can in order to affect some kind of
Yeah. But see,
transformation.
the way we rewrite the programming, it's like, honestly, it doesn't feel like we get a lot of choice in it. It just kind of comes up. It's
Yeah.
not like our mind gets to rewrite the programming. It's not like that. These forces come up within us and say, all right, we're
This,
rewriting this code.
wow. Damn,
Okay.
that's
And
psychedelic.
and the but and it totally overwrites the code that your mind wants to write. I mean,
Yeah.
your mind has no power to really, your mind can't, it can write code, but it needs to write code through like affirmation and really
Hmm.
work writing that code in. It doesn't just get to rewrite code.
Right.
In Eclipse, when an Eclipse makes you rewrite your code, your programming, it's just like, so there's just this force inside of you that goes over to that chalkboard and says, this is how it's going to be now.
Yeah, it's like the
And it's
spirit
like,
is
you don't get
taking
a
you.
choice.
Right.
So there are
Right.
times of surrender. Now, the interesting thing is, during those partial eclipses that happen at the North or South Pole, that's when, it's like, okay, let's just change this by a comma, right?
Hmm.
Okay,
Hmm.
let's just add a word,
Right.
or let's add an idea and not just kind of dwell on it.
Yeah.
When you get those full eclipses, it's like, okay, we're going to really go to work on this now.
Right.
Because the amount the eclipse is happening determines how the chalkboard can be rewritten.
Yeah, that's kind of what I'm thinking about.
So it's like
I've
an eraser. You got this chalkboard. Can the chalkboard be completely erased? Or
hmm
it's just a little corner of the
just
chalkboard going to get erased?
right, because it's so imprinted from the important parts of the eclipse cycle. Like
Yeah.
I
And as
see
the eclipse is waxing, you erase this corner.
mhm.
Next time you erase a little bit of a bigger corner and a bigger corner until one time you erase the whole thing, right?
Uh-huh.
And then
N-
something new gets rewritten. So
I'm almost
they're
thinking
just
of
really
the
fascinating times. And it's something we really need to spend a lot more time researching and testing. And it's like I said, it's the first thing I look for. Oh, what eclipse are you having this year?
right. I totally get it. Like I'm almost thinking to ask Ernst, what is the evolutionary narrative that is leading these eclipses to happen? Like I almost think of how we're saying that we can, when there is the total eclipse and we're experiencing an eclipse that's very intense, is that going to change? Does that change the foundational eclipse in a way? I wonder if you see what I'm trying to ask. Like, we know
Okay.
that there is the
Yeah.
foundational eclipse that has it's brick and mortar stone, but it's
Yeah.
whisper, and it leads up to this finalizing
Yeah.
intense eclipse. Does the first eclipse ever transform itself? And
So
is
what
that what
happens
happened?
is the first eclipse is like the very beginning. So say you say, I'm going to build a house of business.
Hmm.
And you got this vision for the house of business, right?
Hmm.
And then you're going to work towards that vision. And then at the fullness of it, the realization of it, it's like, okay, this is the house of business I've actually created.
Hmm.
It's not going to be the house of business you envision.
Right. It's going to change along the
It's
way.
going to mutate. So it's the same thing like when an author sits down to write a book. He has a vision for the book,
Hmm.
and then he's finished with the book.
Hmm.
Okay, that's the same thing. There's a vision that's motivating everything based on that
Hmm.
foundational eclipse. So like this last one was a Venus eclipse. I have a vision for more Venus, more healthier connections and relationships.
Relationships. Yeah.
And because Mars is involved, I will kill whoever it takes to get to do that.
Right.
I'll do
Right.
whatever it
I'll
takes,
fight. And yeah. Yeah.
That's like that's the author's first idea. I'm gonna create a romance or a story of camaraderie and companionship and mutual love and care. And these characters will do anything to have them
Right.
and to live their to give their to um fulfill their commitment to that.
Hmm. Hmm.
Okay. And then what is that final picture? What actually when the novel goes to print, what's really in it?
Yeah.
That's the full moon eclipse.
Right. The full moon,
The
the
full, not the full moon,
dimension.
but the most
Yeah.
full eclipse chart.
Yes. The total, the
The
most total.
realization of that, exactly,
And that's when the sun and the moon are as close to the node
as possible, as
as
they're going to be the
possible.
closest one, the most. Yeah, and I don't even want to say the closest. It's usually the closest, but not always, because because of the way everything works, it's usually the closest. But you should just check the duration of the eclipse. Like NASA will have all that data. The eclipse is this many hours and minutes long. Oh, it's 5 minutes longer than this one. I want to use the longest one.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
So I almost see, and thank you, Ernst. You've been very patient with giving me your time here. I don't want to, we've been doing great with this video, but I do want to ask. So we start, let's say an eclipse starts at the north node or the north, 1300 years ago, or whatever. Like let's say 1000 AD. It started in the north, and it slowly builds its way to the equator, as you discussed. And that is this culmination point when the node is close to the sun and the moon. And then it starts going south. Now, is there a reflective date going southward that is going to happen in another a certain amount of years? And is that going to be the next foundational
Okay,
eclipse?
so 650 years later, about is going to be the final partial eclipse in that
Right,
cycle.
the final partial.
So see, it's like you start writing the book, and then the
Mm-hmm.
book goes to print and gets out in the world at the full eclipse, right? It
Mm-hmm.
is what it is.
Yeah.
But what impact is that going to have, right?
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Like Harry Potter, right? It had
Mm-hmm.
this impact in literature.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that impact is going to wane over the next, several centuries,
Right. Right.
right? Because every eclipse is getting further away.
Right.
So it has this force. It's like this is the force of what it is at the culmination,
Mm-hmm.
at that closest, longest eclipse, okay? The most full eclipse. That's its culmination. This is the force that it is. Now, that force is going to have an impact for the duration of the cycle,
Right.
for the second half of the cycle. Kind of
Gotcha.
like the waxing moon. During the
Yeah.
waxing moon, we're hustling, we're saying, oh, I would like to see things happen this way. And it starts manifesting out of your consciousness, right?
Right.
Then you get to the waning moon, which is the malefic moon. And
And
it's like, why are these things sort of just happening? Why am I stuck with this? Well, this is kind of the residue, the result of that, all that work you did in the full moon
gotcha.
cycle. Got it?
Very clarifying.
So
Very
it's exactly
clarifying.
the same type of idea, is that we work up to a build up to a point of high success or power.
Mm-hmm.
And then that force is going to have an impact that's going to wane over a period of time
Until it starts to,
until the end of the eclipse cycle. And then that eclipse cycle ends. And
right.
at the same time, again, that one's moving from north to south, there's an eclipse cycle moving to south, from south to north.
Mm-hmm.
And these are a total of about 42 cycles, 21 going each way.
Gotcha. Gotcha.
There's a lot of stories going on. In fact,
Very interesting. And then once it hits the 21, that is going to be a date. So it's almost as if some
you do have a
eclipses
final date. You can say, oh, this is the last eclipse in the cycle.
would
And you
that
can
mean
say,
anything?
okay, what's that?
Would it be useful for us to look that up and see
I think
what
it probably would be. I think it would be kind of good to look up. I haven't done it. Again, like I said, this whole topic needs a lot of work and research. We're
cool.
only touching the surface, I think, of what eclipses can teach us. I would
Gotcha.
also like to understand, like, okay, why are there like 21 north and 21 south? What does that mean?
Yeah.
You
That's
know, why
very
does it
interesting to
happen
me.
every drachana? How can we add more drachana information?
Yeah.
There's
Yeah,
all
that's
these
true.
symbols of the dracanas. Like there's these really extreme symbols that you could draw on the tarot cards, like a
Hmm.
woman in a pit surrounded by snakes. There's these crazy symbols for the dracanas that perhaps we can use. And then the question is, why are there this many themes? Are there different aspects of her being triggered by the themes? I mean, there's a lot of questions to be answered
Cool.
in these Saros cycles, these eclipse cycles.
Wonderful. Well, I got to tell you, Ernst, you know, having you on here to clarify this a little bit, I'm hoping that that we're doing that work and that
Yeah, we're starting
everybody.
it, and hopefully we'll get people inspired to start with the easy book
Hmm.
and see where it takes us. But I mean, just with this book, it's like I was thinking 1992,
Right.
that's when I became an astrologer. I wish I'd found this Eclipse book,
No kidding.
you know. Took me
Cool.
forever to find. One of my students had to tell me about this book. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think it was Channing. So thank you,
Cool.
Channing, if it was you.
Yeah.
I don't remember. I think it was Channing. Told me about
Beautiful.
this book. Um,
Awesome.
so yeah, because her mom was a really great Western astrologer actually, and had bought Kala from me, and then Channing inherited Kala, and then showed up saying, "Hey, I'm so and so's daughter," you know. So I'm pretty
Cool.
sure it was Channing.
Well, that's pretty sweet.
So
And
she
so
would have been
she,
exposed to Western astrology books.
gotcha, gotcha. Very
Yeah, I
interesting.
think it was Channing. But anyway, I was thinking, gosh, that's such an easy book that in such an easy way teaches you to predict and understand really what comes down to be the most important experiences of a person.
Right.
This
Right.
is book's a little over an inch thick, but honestly, it's only like 1/5 of it that's on eclipses. It's like you could throw the
Hmm.
rest away and have a book that's worth $1 million.
Right. No
And
kidding. Yeah,
so,
yeah.
and then if we want to go deeper and understand on a deeper level what's happening, people can be scholarly and dig deeper.
I'm sure
But just
somebody
this
will.
book in this superficial, simple form is wow, is it accurate and solid?
No kidding. And I'm sure that it's, you know, videos like this and the stuff that you do is going to prompt people to start getting into the gold mine that's obviously available here.
Yeah, I think these cycles are really our gold mine, and not only a gold mine in predicting our own lives, but for world events. I mean, you
Right.
cannot predict world events successfully without eclipses. You just
Right.
can't do it.
No kidding.
You need to use the lunar New Year charts and eclipses as the primary tools, and you just need to. And then if you add this cycle information to the eclipses, the world predictions become much more clear because you know
Very
what the
narrow.
theme is.
Yeah.
You know, how do you proceed to predict something? You don't even know what theme it is, you know?
Totally. Totally. So, Ernst, this has been very clarifying. You know, I always have a million questions that I could ask,
Sure.
and I think that this has been we've taken
We've
on
covered a
quite a bit
lot.
here.
I
Yeah.
think this will get a
So,
lot of people psyched up and fired up, which is what our job is, right?
yes, that's what we're all about. We're those guys on YouTube getting everybody to get excited. So thank you very much, Ernst, for taking your time with me. I think we'll call it a day for now.
Yeah, for
And
sure.
maybe I'd love to have you on again. We could talk more. You know, there's even like questions that I see being prompted relate to, you know, like how does a single person, because you're an astrologer, thinking of how to fit the narrative of a coming eclipse into like the coming eclipses for a year into the important things in a person's chart, because you can see that, you know, I would like to ask you this before we go. Do
Okay.
you have all the four eclipses for a year in mind, or at least in the coming four eclipses in your mind, and maybe even the four previous when you do an astrology reading for someone so that you
I mean,
don't.
I always pay attention to it, and I oftentimes will just look up the degrees
Mhm,
because I might not remember the exact degree or something.
mhm,
And then, of course, I have the foundational eclipses calculated.
right,
Oftentimes, I'll calculate out, I'll always calculate out this eclipse, the previous cycle chart, because I want to see the previous cycle's eclipse.
right.
And sometimes, if that's not impacting the people I'm talking to, I want to calculate the previous cycle eclipse. So I calculate the eclipse cycles that are relevant to the chart I'm looking at.
Depending on if
Um,
that's what they're asking you about too, because some people just come for a natal reading, right?
no,
So
I
like,
mean, I wouldn't do a natal reading without knowing what eclipse a person's going to get hit by,
cool,
because I need to know if the planet I'm talking about is going to get triggered with an eclipse.
right? And you mean
Because
with,
say I'm doing a counseling session, it's about their
mhm,
Lagitatia Avashtas, and they've got, you know, a Jupiter with something going on, some Avashta going on, say it's starved, and I know they have an eclipse lining on their Jupiter. I know it's time to rewrite that starved program, right?
right?
So
Okay,
I really want to pay attention to that Jupiter now.
gotcha. Because as astrologers, we're looking to give the most pertinent information that we can.
Exactly. And we don't we realize we don't do it all in one reading. It's not possible. People are too complex.
Cool.
We have to give what's most relevant right now.
Thank you, Ernst. That is exactly what I wanted to ask you. As an astrologer who's starting out, what you just said is really useful to me. I've been in it for a while, but compared to you, I'm just starting.
Well, I'm getting old. You're young. In 20 years, you'll be where I am, you know. You'll be
Love it.
busy and have a lot of background.
Well, thank you, Ernst. I really appreciate your time. So I think we'll call it here so that we
Yeah.
don't get too long-winded on this video. For everybody watching, I'm Dustin Cormier. This has been my friend Ernst Wilhelm. Thank you so much, as usual, for taking all the time that you do to clarify this stuff for us, Ernst.
My pleasure. Thank you.
A real pleasure. Take care, folks.